Well, today we're in my hometown of Liverpool and we're going on a magical mystery tour. We're going to look at the Beatles, their locations in this city. You might think this is a funny place to start. We're in St James's Cemetery overlooking the Anglican Cathedral. But each lunch hour, the lads who are in the Institute, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Len Garry, they would come here with their guitars and they'd have a little busking session. And over the road, we're going to visit it shortly, is Gambia Terrace. That's where John Lennon lived with his friend Stuart Sutcliffe. And they would join them here for a little busking session each lunch hour. So I'd love to have had the tapes of that, of those little sessions, you know, little jam sessions. But this is holy ground because this is an ancient cemetery here. And we're in, obviously, the shadows of the Anglican Cathedral. And John Lennon always said he loved the grandeur of this building. You know, it inspired him. And as much about Liverpool that inspired the Beatles. And we're going to look at what it was about Liverpool that created the soil from which the Beatles came. We're outside the Liverpool Institute School, which is one of the most important routes of the Beatles. This is where Paul McCartney, George Harrison and Len Garry were pupils here. Len Garry's very important because he was in the Quarrymen at the foundation of the Beatles. And he was one of the links between Paul and John. We're going to go to Wootton Village shortly and we're going to see where Paul met John. But Len Garry played a pivotal part with Ivan Vaughan, who also went here to Liverpool Institute, in introducing Paul to John. Now this school was a grammar school. It was probably the top grammar school in the northwest of England. Over 300 of its pupils went on to Oxbridge over its history. It was the intellectual heart of Liverpool in many ways. Although it was a state school, it was very similar to a public school. It had the same ethos, the same traditions, the same culture. It was very much a Christian school, and it was very much classical education that Paul and George received here. This was a rich soil on which to grow. And although they didn't really sort of thrive at school, Paul and George, I don't think they got a qualification between them, they still absorbed the wisdom and the knowledge that was at the school. And it gave them the confidence, to go out into the big world and take on any challenge. I mean, one of the things about the Beatles is they were open to any experience, any other culture, because they were rooted in their own culture. They were very secure and their own culture was very deep. It gave them a strength to take on the world. This was Britain in the 1950s and 60s. This was the end of the empire. And these boys were coming out of that culture. And that's why they had this exuberance about them. That's why there was nothing that could faze them. And so there's two routes of the Beatles. This is one, the grammar schools. John Lennon also went to a grammar school, which we'll visit later. But the other route was the church, which we're also going to look at. They were all members of church choirs, and that was very significant in their musical and spiritual development. And so we'll look at that shortly. This is next door to the Liverpool Institute School. This is the Liverpool College of Art, where John Lennon studied. He had an interesting time here. He was a bit of a maverick. But this is where he also met Stuart Sutcliffe, who was a real inspiration to John. Stuart Sutcliffe was the outstanding student in this college. He was a superb artist. I've seen some of his work. And he was a member of the early Beatles before he tragically died of a brain hemorrhage, which is a big story in itself. Anyway, John came here and was introduced to new different art movements, different ideas. And, you know, it was called the avant-garde, look into the future, new styles, revolutionary styles. John Lennon called this avant-garde in a beautiful description. He said that avant-garde is French for bullshit, because although he was a pupil here, he didn't really take it that seriously. His love was music, of course, and he was having a good time, and that's what mattered to him. But Stuart Sutcliffe led him on a journey of discovery, and we're going to follow that where they lived together here in Gambia Terrace. This is number 3, Gambia Terrace, where John Lennon had a flat with Stuart Sutcliffe. There's quite a story to this flat, because in 1960, which is almost 60 years ago, the Sunday Mirror ran a big story about the beatniks who were living here and the squalor and the degradation they were living in. It was an attack on the sort of the youth culture at the time. Quite funny, really, because obviously John Lennon was to go on to better things. But this is a beautiful terrace here, Georgian Terrace. This part of Liverpool is known as the Georgian Quarter. It's a lot of beautiful sort of Georgian property from the start of the 19th century, and it was just showed the prosperity of Liverpool at that time. This was a great port, you know, and it went on to become the great port of the empire. And of course, John Lennon is probably its most famous son now. Well, what was distinctive about Liverpool was its confidence, and it was, you know, it was the leading town in Britain. It was the fastest growing town in Britain, and that was a Britain that was didn't compromise. It exported itself to the world. It didn't sort of allow the world to invade it, you know, because it had a culture that it wanted to export. It had a vigour that drove it overseas. But John Lennon come out of that culture, as did Stuart Sutcliffe. Very creative people. You're from China, yeah?
Yeah.
Which part of China?
Yeah. We've come from different
parts of China.
Yes.
And you're Beatles fans?
Yeah.
What do you know about the Beatles?
Yes.
What do you know about them? Do you know their music?
Yeah, I
Hey
love
Jude.
Hey
Yeah,
Jude,
Hey Jude and,
real famous.
Let It Be, and Drive My Cars, and many.
So you knew about the Beatles when you knew that the Beatles came from Liverpool?
Yes.
You always knew that? Is this your first time in Liverpool?
Yeah, we
Yes,
came
the
here
first
to
time.
visit the museum, the story of
What's
Beatles.
your impression of Liverpool?
Impression.
Wait.
The sea is beautiful.
You know, this seafront is very similar to Shanghai. You know that in the 1930s?
Yes.
It was a big port, you know.
Yeah.
You had a lot of contacts with China, Hong Kong, Shanghai.
Yeah.
But I think Shanghai is more
Bigger, much
bigger
bigger.
than
maybe, yeah.
Oh, more.
And more
But
crowded.
are you going to any other Beatles sites in Liverpool?
Maybe the Carbon.
The
Pub.
Cabin and Matthew Street? There are many
we-
sites around Liverpool connected with the Beatles, and people go on Beatle tours. You go to see the different sites.
Okay.
People call this Beatles City now.
Yeah.
It's so popular.
Yes.
It's so popular.
Yeah. What else about Liverpool do you know besides
Football.
the Beatles?
Football team, the football
Football, yeah. Yeah. So do you know anything about Liverpool's past? Do you know anything about Liverpool's history?
Actually, no. But we saw
Yeah.
Second War.
Not very much, but
Yeah.
we know this. It's famous for this ships.
Ships, yeah, shipping, yeah, the
Yeah,
sea.
yes.
The big port. You've heard of the British Empire? The British Empire in the 19th century. Hong Kong,
Yeah.
India, Malaysia,
yeah.
Australia, much of Africa were all part of the British Empire. It was all ruled from London, and Liverpool was the port of the empire. So the ships went from here to all over the world, you know. They would go to Hong Kong.
Trade.
International trade to South America, to the West Indies. Goods from all over the world came here. Now Liverpool has the oldest Chinatown in Europe. There was Chinese living here before the 20th century, Chinese sailors.
Yeah.
So we had connections with the whole world, you know, from here. So it was a great port.
Yeah.
And the Beatles, what do you think about the Beatles as people? They were quite lively people,
Yes.
quite funny,
Yeah.
quite confident.
Yeah, they attribute the love to the world.
Oh, they gave love to the world,
Yeah,
I like
love
that.
and peace.
Yeah,
Imagine
love
the
and peace. Yeah. Okay, thanks a lot, girls.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
There are some rivers in England, mighty rivers, the Thames, the Severn, but I don't think anything competes with the Mersey. It's just a massive estuary, you know. Here's the ferry coming across now, and Of course, at the time of the Beatles, we had Jerry and the Pacemakers, we had the whole Merseybeat phenomenon, and we had the famous song Ferry Across the Mersey, which I'm tempted to sing as it moves in. But this was a great city, a bustling city, and those were the days of when Britain was still on the up, 1960s. We still had our roots right across the English-speaking world, our connections. Trade was flowing into Liverpool. And then in 1973, we joined the common market, and it all come to a shuddering halt because we cut off our roots from America and from our contacts with the Commonwealth, and we refocused onto the European Union as it became, and trade moved to the East Coast. And Liverpool went into quite a steep decline at that time. But it's bounced back quite sharply now. And the Beatles are one of the main reasons for that. They came from the 1960s, from the glory days of Liverpool, you know, and they've been part of the cultural renaissance of this city. People are looking back with nostalgia to an old Britain. I mean, it's very symbolic, isn't it, that the Beatles are 4 white lads, the 4 quintessential English boys, grammar school boys, choir boys, and that's a Britain that is sort of in retreat now. We're in a more multicultural Britain. I mean, to simply have 4 white lads together now is almost an affront to a multicultural society. So we've lost the world that the Beatles came from. And that's why I say Beatlemania is very much a nostalgia for the past. But it's a past that we need to reinvigorate and we need to bring up to the future. Because what is the benefit of multiculturalism if we are displaced and replaced? If instead of the Beatles, 4 English boys, we have 4 boys from somewhere else, I don't know, Africa, Asia, China, they're not British, are they? We're cutting ourselves off from our past and our history. And that's the Beatles now are almost representative of British history, of the glory that was what was in this nation. And it's almost like the closing chapter of the book as we become a totally different society, a lost society, a lost world now. So we need to not let that go so easily. We need to re-embrace our past in order to have a future. This is a quintessential Liverpool scene, the ferry docking on the pier head. I mean, John Lennon and the boys, Paul McCartney, would have got this ferry over to New Brighton when they had gigs on the other side of the river. Often they performed at the Floral Hall in New Brighton and the Tower Ballroom. And they would catch the ferry with their equipment and they'd head over the river. And it's great to see that this ferry is still in operation. It's part of the tourist industry in Liverpool now. It's a city of nostalgia, you know. A city that looks back to the 60s, the Merseybeat with great enthusiasm, you know, and the whole world comes here to celebrate it. So these are the 4 lads that shook the world, the Beatles, here on display at the Liverpool waterfront, the pier head, with this backdrop of these glorious buildings, imperial buildings from the height of the empire. And yeah, Liverpool's become almost Beatles City now. People come to this city to visit the sites that are linked with the Beatles. And there's almost a reverence there. It's almost like going on a pilgrimage now. It's a new religion, Beatlemania. It still survives. And I was just talking to those Chinese girls there, and they talked about peace and love. There's an underlying philosophy in the Beatles as well. That comes from the Christian roots. And we're going to go and visit the church in Woolton, where the Beatles actually were formed in 1957, St. Peter's. That was the day that I met Paul, that it started moving. This is the parish hall where the Beatles were born. This is where Paul McCartney was first introduced to John Lennon and played his rendition of 20 Flight Rock by Eddie Cochran, which so impressed Lennon that he was invited to join Lennon's new band, the Quarrymen. There's a guy on here, Len Gary, old friend of mine. He knew Paul from the school, Liverpool Institute, where we visited earlier, and he was the bridge between the two of them. So it's pretty symbolic that they met in a parish hall, and they were first performing at a church fete for St. Peter's Church over the road. We'll be visiting there shortly. But it's like, again, it's a traditional English upbringing in the 1950s. The Beatles weren't born into a politically correct society. They were born into a very traditionalist British society. The church was the centre of a lot of the social life. They had strong families. There was no questions about gender in those days. There were just two genders, male and female. It was very straightforward, very wholesome life. And that's why the Beatles are so strong. They come across as very masculine figures, even though they experimented with drugs and they became hippies in a sense. But they come out of this rich soil of Britain, traditional Britain in the 50s and 60s. And that rich soil enabled them to grow very tall indeed. In fact, to become the biggest phenomenon the world's seen since the Second World War. Let's visit the church, St. Peter's Church. Right, we've arrived at St. Peter's Church in Wilton, which was John Lennon's family church. His Aunt Mimi and Uncle George brought him here every Sunday. He sang in the choir, was taught how to project his voice. But when he wrote the famous anthem, Give Peace a Chance, the night before he wrote that, he had the vision of this cross, which is in front of St. Peter's Church. Celtic cross with the word peace at the base. This was a memorial to the dead of the First World War. And this is Give Peace a Chance. This was John Lennon's theme. So it shows you the roots of his philosophy were in the Christian faith. And we're going to go and look inside the church now. We're going to go and visit a very famous grave. Grave of Eleanor Rigby, the eponymous hero of Paul McCartney's song about all the lonely people. She was actually the wife of Tommy Woods, and she died in 1939. And it's quite emblematic. It's quite emblematic of the Beatles that they drew so much from this church, from their Christian background. This was a grave. They mined this world that they inhabited as youths, and they found so much in it. This name must have stuck in the mind of John Lennon. Must have stuck in his mind, because it just come up subconsciously into the name of the song. He said he didn't actually recollect that it was in the graveyard, but the name just appeared to him. Rigby is actually quite a common name on Merseybeat, in the Liverpool area. Now you can imagine what an impact this coming to this church every week must have had on John Lennon, shaping his spirituality and his view of the world. I mean, he sort of challenged his Christian faith as he got older. We know that he cast it off for a time. But there's an apocryphal story, which I tend to believe, that John Lennon, shortly before he was shot, bowed in front of the TV set in America. This is what Yoko Ono said, during the Pat Robinson 700 show, and gave his life to the Lord. Pat Robinson invited people to pray for repentance of their sins and to show faith in Jesus Christ. John Lennon did that in his flat in New York City. So although he wrestled with his Christian faith, although at one stage he seemed to have thrown it overboard, it was deep in his soul, and he always was sort of searching for salvation, searching spiritually. And I think he returned to the Christian faith shortly before his death. But it was the basis, the foundation on which he built his whole life. So, a lot of the emotions and the philosophy of the Beatles, the philosophy of peace, the philosophy of love, the philosophy of togetherness and brotherhood, came from his Christian faith. And it's sad today that so many kids, they don't have these roots. They want to espouse big ideas, but they don't have any spiritual depth. But the Beatles had that. Because Paul McCartney, he went to St Barnabas Church on Penny Lane, and Stuart Sutcliffe, who was very influential in the formation of the Beatles, he was a choir boy at Highton Parish Church. Ringo Starr, Richard Stark, his real name, he went to St Philemon's Church in Toxteth, and I actually have attended that church many times, and he's made generous donation to that church. They all value this Christian heritage that they had, and it was the security and the wisdom they got from this Christian faith which enabled them to explore other faiths. They went astray, sadly, but I think they always had the narrow path to return to. Thank you for watching this video on some of the cultural heritage of the Beatles. We're trying to make videos to show our love for this country, to show that there's so much to be valued in this country, and we need to defend our heritage. We feel that it's under severe threat at the moment, not only from political correctness, but also from mass immigration. And we want to show people that it's worth defending Britain. We need to rise up to defend this culture. And we've enjoyed making this video today. If you've enjoyed it, please feel free to donate. There is a PayPal connection in the description. Also feel free to subscribe, and there'll be more videos coming out shortly. Thank you.